Welcome to the Americanism Book Study. I'm Cody Leibolt, and this is the third of 9 meetings, Saturdays all the way through December 18th, 2021. We're studying a new textbook of Americanism, The Politics of Ayn Rand. This week, the reading section was from pages 35 through 50. We may go through the book in closer detail this week, or we may continue discussing the connections between Christianity and the themes of the book. If you're watching live on Zoom, you can use the comment section to come in and join on video, join on audio, or just use the comments. And I will read whatever you write in there. For anyone that's watching the replay, you are welcome to sign up for the webinar series. You can go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism to get the information. It's /Americanism. So we are discussing what is Americanism. In other words, how is society in the United States different from most other societies throughout history? What is the essential characteristic of the American society? How can that characteristic be preserved and strengthened? There are many opinions on this, and this book suggests a very specific answer to that. So this book study is equipping future speakers and intellectual warriors. We want people to join in to practice expressing their thoughts. This is to get to know each other, to get the chance to just spend some time together, because we are building a movement at christianintellectual.com. And we want more people to be able to be ready to present on stage. So if you would like to join this, if you'd like to get some experience with interacting with other people's ideas, perhaps even presenting, we would love to talk with you about that. So the chapters that we looked at this week were chapters 5 and 6. They were from Jonathan Hoenig on property rights, dividing fortunes such as inheritances, and compulsion versus cooperation, and then Andrew Bernstein on freedom versus dictatorship. And he addresses 3 questions: communism versus fascism, what's the difference? Does capitalism create poverty? And is capitalism efficient? And one more question was, are dictators efficient? So we can discuss those chapters in depth, but I want to invite anybody that's watching, especially if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism, and you can actually join on the webinar. You can come on video. You can come on audio or however you want. I want to make sure everybody knows as you're watching this, we are doing this so that people can jump in and interact live. So I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to invite all the live participants to switch over to video. So let's see. It just takes a second. I have to go through and promote everybody. Good morning, guys.
Hey, Cody, how's it going?
Hey, good to see you. Okay, looks like I've got everybody that wants to be promoted for now. And let's start out by this week. I'm going to ask you, do you have specific questions that you would want to make sure that we cover in the video at some point in this hour? Questions either about the 2 chapters we read this week, that'd be chapters 5 and 6, or if you have questions in general about just the ideas and about why Ayn Rand focuses on individualism and individual rights as being the essence of the United States of America, and also how does that work within a Christian worldview? Is that true if the Bible is also true? So I'd like to just take a moment and write down questions, just collect the questions. Go ahead and put them in the comments, or you can come on live and ask your question if you would like. And it's okay if they're questions for general discussion as well. It doesn't have to be a specific question that you don't know the answer to, but maybe a question that you think would be worth discussing.
Here's one. Oftentimes when you talk to people who are socialists or some kind of mixed economy proponents, they want to get into the weeds of statistics between different countries, and they want to prove to you using real world examples that capitalism is not efficient, and they'll pull up a bunch of articles and a bunch of charts and graphs that point to things that have been happening recently. Whereas this book really delves into the philosophical foundations of capitalism and argues for it on a completely different basis. It doesn't try to say, here's the GDP and ratio against the debt of all these nations that use capitalism as opposed to some other mixed economy or socialism. how do we interact when someone wants to say, well, let's look at a bunch of examples and statistics, whereas we want to say, let's look at the philosophical and moral foundations of such a system. How do we start a conversation? How do we allow that kind of conversation to move forward?
Yeah, that is an outstanding question. I would love to spend time discussing that one. And before we even dive into that one, are there other similar questions from anyone else who's watching, or any that you've got, Andrew? I'll leave you a chance to think about it for a moment if there's any other questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and, I think we should just start with discussing that question because that was a really strong question. I mean, I see that there was a message in the chat, but I'm not seeing the message for some reason. So raise your hand if you'd like to come on camera. Oh, here we go. There's the new message. It's going to take a second for me to figure out how to read it because my Zoom thing is there. We go. Okay, so this is a question from Rob, and he says, without the importance of the individual shown to us by God's specific creation to us, what is the foundation of the objectivist or secular view of the individual? It seems progressives specifically care about humanity, but hate people. Okay, that's also an outstanding question. So let me go ahead and put that in my notes. And we will, I'd say let's get to that one after we talk about Andrew's. So Andrew had brought up this idea of talking with socialists or mixed economy advocates. They want to show other countries statistics. Like, for example, they'll say, well, there's socialized medicine in Denmark, or there's some kind of socialistic practice in the country of Sweden or something like that. And the big difference between the way most people are arguing for capitalism or free markets today versus the way this book does it is most people are going to argue today in terms of, well, let's look at the numbers with you and let's figure it out and we'll answer your immediate questions. But they're not also adding to that the moral component, the philosophical component. And I think that we should do both. And so one of the things in Andrew Bernstein's chapter in this, it's in the 6th chapter, is he mentions that the argument for freedom and against dictatorship or against economic controls is fundamentally an argument about what is morally right and wrong. But then he says it's also a felicitous occurrence that when you follow what's morally right, it's also better for you. It's also going to bring more wealth. And I might be able to dig in and find that where he says that, but it's in chapter 6. So we who believe this particular approach to political theory, because I generally accept Rand's political theory, we would not argue first about what's going to create more wealth. Because, I mean, if someone were in a made-up universe that doesn't exist, to be able to prove that I could be more wealthy and maybe all my family or all the people that have the same color skin as me could be more wealthy if we just enslaved the rest of the world, that would not be an argument that that's what we should do. I mean, that's sort of the Nazi argument, is they said our nation is the best nation and we're going to make all the other nations our slaves. Or that's the argument of slave owners in the American South. We don't believe in that. Also, we don't think that that is the most efficient way of creating wealth. We actually think that slavery and war are inefficient means of creating wealth. But historically, they have been means of creating wealth. We're not going to disagree with that. I mean, the fact that the Vikings existed for centuries is a demonstration that you can survive in a certain way, a subhuman way, by preying off of other human beings. Nobody would deny that. You can, but it creates a very messed up life because by definition, you're a thief. The people that are helping you are thieves. So who can you trust? And it creates unending war. It makes it so that cooperation and the improvement of wealth over time in great quantities like we see under capitalism cannot happen because it's just war the whole time. So the fundamental argument for capitalism, for economic freedom, for individual rights and property rights is that we as human beings survive by using our minds, long range, and that whatever is necessary to be able to individually use our own minds, long range, to produce and to then control the use of what was produced, that is going to create the conditions necessary for human flourishing. So anything that goes against that, like for example, a minimum wage law, or a government taking control of half the economy and telling everybody this is your job, this is your job, that deprives people not just of their ability to make choices, but their ability to use their mind. And that's the component that Rand points out. And so she could say, okay, yeah, sure, Bernie Sanders makes an argument about Denmark having socialized medicine. And she could say, yeah, we'll talk about the facts all you want, that's fine. But primarily, you have to understand the long-term consequences. In principle, when you take away the choices of people to decide who they think is a good doctor and who they don't, to take away the choices of the individual doctors, are they going to pursue this career because they chose to, and they're going to pursue it the way that they chose to? If you take away those choices, for the short term, things might not collapse. In the long term, though, which country is going to have more medical innovation, Denmark or the United States? Well, there has been in the last 100 years something in Europe called the brain drain. And that's something Rand talks about in another place, is people from England or other countries in Europe that wanted to pursue higher education in the field of medicine especially would move to the United States because that was freer in the field of medicine, and because that was going to be a chance for them to make more money and practice the way they wanted to without being told that this is what your job is by someone that doesn't know anything about medicine. So the danger of what's going on in Denmark is that they will stop progress. And that's happened in the United States now too. I mean, if you look at medical progress in the United States, it's not what it used to be. The pace at which new discoveries are being made is not the same. So that's a consequence of our increasingly socialized system. Any questions about that, or anyone want to jump in?
No, that's really helpful. I think that people, when they start to go to statistics and graphs and wanting to look at particulars of individual countries as they are, what they're doing is that they're smuggling in the unspoken premise that whatever basically the premise is we should choose a system of social organization based on which countries right now or maybe in the past 100 years have produced the best material results in the short term, and that's a premise that we should challenge. And but I do think that it would also be good, it's also valuable to be able to argue them on the merits of that exact argument. Like you said, let's actually be able to debate the facts as well. And I think there are people, I think Alex Epstein is one who's been really good at doing that. And, Yaron Brook obviously has a lot up his sleeve to be able to deal with that. But yeah, I appreciate that answer.
Andrew, if you'd like, you know what, I didn't realize that it's not letting you jump in on video. Just let me know once you come in on audio, and I will, if you're wanting to jump on video, I can make you a co-host, and that'll change it. So, yeah, let's talk about Denmark. This is a topic that I would want to refresh my understanding of what the situation is currently in Denmark, because I look at it maybe 10 years ago. It's been that long since I've seriously thought about the medical situation in Denmark. But the issue that you need to understand is that most of the comparisons being made between, like, say, Sweden and the United States or Denmark and the United States are comparisons between two mixed economies that have different mixtures in different quantities. So if you look up the index of economic freedom in the world, you'll realize that the United States is not even the most economically free country because of the taxes and controls that are placed on businesses. So there are some economies like Denmark that for a long time have had socialized medicine. And when they do that, they're subsidizing the health industry from some other means. And if they have an economy that is more economically free, if they have businesses more free, less regulations, or if they just have more natural wealth, like for example, Sweden has oil, I believe, the overall consequence is comparing apples to oranges. What you have to do, if you want a more fair comparison, is to ask yourself, what's the difference between a country like North and South Korea, or back in the 80s, like East and West Germany, or what's the difference between two different countries that were similar in terms of their natural resources, in terms of their society, but then they got split into two different economic systems. Then you can see the consequences in a way that's more scientific, and you can look at a better comparison. I'm reading through the notes right now. Okay, yeah, Jacob, to answer your question, we did not talk about inheritance yet, but I'd love to hear anything that you have to say about that one. Let me add you in there. Okay, Jacob, would you like to jump in on camera?
Can
You're
you hear
welcome
me?
to. Yeah, let me make you a co-host. Yeah, so far the questions that we talked about are mainly Andrew's question, which is, what do you do about people that say, "Hey, Denmark has socialism, and that's comparable to maybe the United States is better." We could go an entire hour or 2 hours talking about those kinds of comparisons, but let's talk about you brought up this thing about inheritance and the morality of people being able to give their inheritance to the person of their choice and not have it taxed away.
Yeah, as I was reading that chapter, a thought occurred to me that I don't think Honing mentioned in the chapter, and I'm kind of surprised that objectivists haven't brought this up yet. And that is that the argument that people who are for an estate tax or a death tax, if you will, the people who want to impose that type of tax often make the argument that, well, the inheritor, the beneficiary didn't earn the money, and so they don't deserve it. But and on that grounds, they say, well, then we're right to go ahead and tax it. But you never hear that argument used for charity being taxed. But it's the same premise, right? The recipient of a charitable giving didn't earn it. That's kind of the definition of charity. But they wouldn't argue that therefore that person should be taxed, that the gift should be taxed, and that it should be taken from the recipient. I mean, that would be monstrous. They would run from such an idea. So they only want to use that argument when they're talking about you giving something to your son or to your daughter, to someone in your family. So there's something insidious going on there that I don't think anybody has quite identified yet, and it's good to point out that they're not being honest with that argument. That there's something else going on that they don't want to say regarding their rationale.
Yeah, and probably the rationale, really, it's just an excuse for they think that society as a whole needs to be controlling the wealth and redistributing the wealth. And
Mhm.
so, if somebody says, well, let's tax charities, they would say, no, no, the whole point is that redistribution. That's how they would argue. Whereas, if somebody's saying, I want to keep my inheritance in my family, they would say, oh no, that's going to create inequalities long term, because then somebody gets a head start over somebody else, and they have, you've seen that little video where there's people that are told, you have to start the race here, you have to start the race here, and they're
Yeah.
looking at life as a zero-sum game, and they're thinking that is an injustice. That's the egalitarian premise, like the John Rawls egalitarianism from the 1970s, that in his book A New Theory of Justice. And that is the theory that teaches us that inequalities are just as such in justice. And that's something that Andrew Bernstein in his chapter, or it might have been Jonathan Honig in his chapter, I forget, but at the end of the chapter, one of them addresses this head on and says, no, 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 the inequalities are a good thing because people don't work equally. Why should people who are working in equal amounts, sacrificing inequally, for whatever, like the time that they have to put into their job, or how hard it is, why should they be compensated all exactly the same? Inequality is a good thing, and usually the left, and even Republicans now these days, because they're all leftists anyway, they all are going to look at that inequality and say that's a problem. They just assume it, but they never argue it.
Yeah. My point is just that. So the argument, your son didn't earn the inheritance, that seems plausible to people, like to just the general public, that makes it palatable to say, oh, okay, well then maybe we should tax it. So if you point out, well, no, you don't really mean that argument, so you can't have that argument because you don't want to tax the charities that also didn't earn it, then that forces them to be more honest about their philosophy and their real rationale for the tax, which is this universal equality and egalitarianism, which is less palatable to the common man. or
I
ideally
agree.
should be.
The funny thing is, if they say your son did not earn it, therefore he shouldn't have it, it's like, wow, so you don't believe in welfare at all? Like you don't believe in
Yeah,
socialism at all? Is that
exactly.
really what you're
Yeah.
saying?
Or you don't believe in taxes.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Hey,
I
let's
had a
go.
thought.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah,
Can I add you on camera, Andrew?
yeah, go. Yeah, feel free.
It's just well, I think you just have to accept co-host
Ah,
permission.
there I am.
There you go.
Yeah, yeah. So, Jacob, what you were saying got me thinking because I just got out of this quarter that I just finished up in law school. I finished up a class on trusts and estates and a class on federal income tax. And what I was thinking is, oftentimes you can kind of that argument that you pointed out that we shouldn't impose an estate tax because the beneficiaries didn't earn their inheritance. You can kind of almost see a spectrum of arguments of justifications for capitalism. On this side, which is the really, really bad arguments for capitalism, you might say, well, capitalism it's the out of all the bad systems, it's the least bad just because it happens to make people richer, and like they're not ignoring the facts of history that okay, I grant you that America is the wealthiest nation, and they were it's capitalism that enabled that. And then you kind of have something in the middle. It's a better argument, but it's not really the real true justification. And that is, well, really, if you work and earn something, it's better for someone who works to get something than someone who didn't work, because we want a bunch of people to be working. We want a society where everyone's working, and that's the goal. And then, but see, that's a little bit better. But really, the best justification is what these authors are saying, which is, what is the property? Metaphysically speaking, what is the origin of it? Whose is it? Who has the moral claim to it? And that actually answers the inheritance question. Whereas this middle justification that's pretty decent can kind of get confused. And that's why it's important to know what's the real justification for capitalism. Because if you get that wrong, you're going to start to get these slightly more abstract questions of what about inheritance? You're going to get that wrong. But I like how Honig said about a wristwatch. Do I have the right to give my wristwatch to my wife or to my kid one day? Of course. And so that the question of who really owns it, who has the moral claim to the property, that's really the root, and that's going to enable you to get more questions correct as you go down the line.
Yeah, the funny thing is that principled thinking works both ways, and the more society becomes convinced that you giving something to your son or a relative needs to be taxed, the more they eventually will say, well, no, that wristwatch is a gift that needs to be taxed also. So you can go in both directions. It just depends on how consistently society is taking the principle at that point in time.
That reminds me of this Janet Yellen going and saying that the federal government should start taxing unrealized gains. It's like, well, yeah, they could tax you for anything that they want. If once you embrace the principle of taxation, they could just make up taxes, because ultimately it's not there's not an objective criteria for why they should be able to tax something or not. Ultimately, what it represents is the government says, you have to give me this, and that's the end of the story. It's just a fiat choice. And that's why we had the Tea Party. I mean, the original Tea Party is even on that very small tax on tea and not on everything else. Maybe there's a stamp tax, there's a tea tax, very small. They realized in principle what you're saying is we can levy whatever we want, because there is no just way to determine what from me belongs to somebody else. There's no way that's the principle, and that's going to be abused. And that actually comes up in the reading from this week. All right, let's go to, there's a comment in here from Ryan, and he says, a thought I had after reading that chapter: the same people least likely to support the unencumbered giving of wealth to descendants are the least likely to have descendants. When one is the least likely to enjoy a right, is it reasonable to assume that they will be the least likely to defend that right? Naturally, we think about the things that are related to us, and that's a good thing. But yeah, I've heard arguments from people saying there should not be an inheritance at all. Like this person said, when my dad dies, I want all that money to go to the government. And when pressed on the point, it turned out that that person's dad was not planning to give them any inheritance, and that they were bitter about that. and that they thought therefore there should be no inheritance because they don't want other people getting inheritances when they know they're not going to. And bitterness is the only argument for totalitarianism, so that's no surprise. Ryan goes on also, if Christian socialists believe that we shouldn't be able to have something that we didn't earn, no wonder they eventually jettison the gospel. Now, there are rich connections in that, and we have argued that a lot at the Christian Intellectual website. So go there, find articles about Tim Keller and so on. Okay, there was another question that we got right at the beginning of the video, and this one was from Rob, and he said, without the importance of the individual shown to us by God's specific creation of us, what is the foundation of the objectivist or the secular view of the individual? It seems progressives specifically care about humanity but hate people. So the question here, if I understand it correctly, is what is it that makes it so that Ayn Rand or any objectivist thinker is able to uphold individual rights? If that political theory rests on an understanding of the value of the individual, then why is it that somebody that doesn't even believe in the Christian belief system can still understand the value of the individual? And the answer to that question is you do not need to read the Bible in order to understand the value of the individual. There are more than one kind of revelation that is authoritative from God about what is right and wrong, and about God's character. This is clear in Romans 1. And we talk about this a lot at our Christian Intellectual project because this is something that most people don't know about. But the unbelievers who have no access to Scripture, have never met the prophets, they know that certain things are right and wrong based on natural law. And so everybody is without excuse. Like, let's say Joseph Stalin had never heard of God. He had never read the Scriptures. I don't know if that's true, but let's say he hadn't. What he did was still wrong, and he still had every reason to know that it was wrong. That's really the implication of what we're talking about here. Do the unbelievers know that individuals have worth and that murder is wrong? And so it's not a surprise that people like Aristotle or Ayn Rand are able to look at the natural world and come to conclusions about how human beings live and the value of an individual human being. The principle that the objectivists bring to bear on this topic is usually an appeal to consistency. So they'd say, I don't want for anybody to come in and just grab all my stuff and punch me. And I think that morally, I think that I should be left alone. Well, then they say, okay, be consistent. Apply that. If that's true, then why wouldn't it be true for somebody that's of the same kind of nature as you are? Other people would be entitled to the same things that you're entitled to because they are the same kind of things that you are. Whereas, you could chop down a tree, you could harvest your crops, but you can't treat people like something to be harvested because that's not the nature of a person. Any comments on that? And Rob, if you're listening, I'll give you first chance on that if you want to interact with him.
Yeah, no, that does help. I think, just as an aside, I think Stalin actually studied to be a priest at one point. Maybe he was in a seminary or something, which is another interesting point for him. But I think that helps. It just feels like the objectivist gets like 90% of the way there, but misses that last 10% of why this is true. And that's a big miss. But I do agree with what you're saying about that revelation and how you just kind of instinctually or however know that there is infinite value in the individual.
Yeah, the idea of infinite value, that's come up in our discussions. I wouldn't ascribe infinite value to anything other than God himself, but I think that infinite perhaps has a couple of different senses in it.
That's fair. Yeah,
I mean, like how big is the universe or something like that? Infinity is an interesting concept. It may be more of a construct rather than an actuality. But that's very speculative. You could apply that concept of infinity to God, although it's an interesting discussion to have. But the idea of the value of the individual, clearly, if you look around at the things around us, your child is more valuable than a tree, and there's nothing in the whole world that's more valuable than that one child or another like that child. And so then the other aspect of the question that you brought up, Rob, was the the collectivizing approach, which says, oh, no, the group is more important than the individuals that constitute it. And that is also an argument that you wouldn't necessarily have to have scripture in order to understand that metaphysically the individual is primary, that there are no groups unless they're individuals, and that you have to look at how the groups are composed in order to understand how you should treat that group. If it's a group of human beings, that's different than if it's a group of ants. And the way that you know the difference is you would say, well, how does a human being live? And the human beings, their way of life is using their mind. And they have this mind that an ant doesn't have. And so that's the objectivity. That's the fact that you can point to, the difference that makes the difference. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about something that you mentioned in your last kind of speech, Cody. You said that the objectivist appeals to consistency. It says, all right, if I want my stuff to be protected and I want my rights to be protected, well, then I should do the same for others. And I wanted to kind of dig into why I think that's different, and then give my answer and then ask for your answers, just briefly, as to why is that different from Kant's conception of the universal law that, anything you do, it has to satisfy the criterion of everyone should be able to do it in order for it to be moral. And that's his moral, that was one of Kant's moral justifications. And I think really what objectivists are getting at is, I want my life to be protected, but it's more than just, I happen to want that because it's what I feel myself wanting. I actually think I have a moral right to it. And if it's true that I have a moral right to it, then that would also be true of every other individual. They're not saying I can't justify my own actions unless everyone else could do the same concrete action as me. Yeah, because then you could say, well, not every single person can run a Fortune 500 company. The moral justification that differs from Kant's is, Rand is saying, I have a right to my life, and it's more than just I feel that I want. That's kind of what separates her from Nietzsche. And so she's saying, I morally deserve to be able to protect my own life. And so that's how I see that, because what I heard, I could imagine someone who was listening for the first time say, oh, that's kind of like Kant, but it's worlds apart from Kant. So I wanted to hear maybe what you think. How does that differ from Kant's? I think he called it the universal law, or the formula of the universal law of nature. How does Rand's idea of individual rights applied universally to every individual? How does that differ from Kant?
That's a outstanding point, and I'm glad that you said that. Okay, so the way that Kant approached it was he would ask, is there a universal, what do you call it, a universal obligation, or I forget the specific term that he used, categorical imperative, and he tried to come up with it. He rationalized and said that there must be such a thing, and then what would such a thing have to be? And that's the opposite approach to what I would advocate, which is the inductive method. And the inductive method doesn't start by saying, well, there has to be such thing as duty, so therefore what could fit the qualities of duty? I mean, that's fiat. Again, there's no grounding for that. And rather, what the objectivists are doing is observing that this is the kind of being that I am, and this is what is necessary for the kind of being that I am to live. And then they say, I choose to live. And they actually base their moral code is based at the very heart on a choice to live. Everything else follows from that choice to live. And then they say, given that I have chosen to live. So they don't start like Kant does with a categorical imperative. They start with a hypothetical imperative, which is, given that I am choosing to pursue values, and I'm choosing to pursue viable values long term, therefore, what kind of choices must I make? And from there, they're going to expand it to, well, any criteria that I say that I have the right to this, other people would have the right to as well. And then they go on and they believe that rights are objective, that they're not like you were talking about, Andrew. They don't believe that a right is just because you said so or because the government said so. They believe that it is an objective thing. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we have a good epistemology. Because, somebody might ask, well, okay, what do you mean when you say that a right is objective, that it's a real thing? Like, I don't see it anywhere. And, somebody like Plato might come along and say, well, it's an idea, and ideas exist in some other reality, like these, pyramids and cubes and ideal things, these ideal concepts that exist in some other world, like in the mind of God, perhaps. But that's not Rand's approach to identifying rights. She would say that a right is just it's a principle of action. It's a principle that applies because of observation X, Y, and Z, and it's an inference from observations about the way people live. And she can say it's true because we've observed X, Y, and Z, and then she makes this complicated argument. But I mean, it's going to take a complicated argument to be able to demonstrate that there is such a principle that people must live by if they're going to live. But it's all if they're going to live. And you can, using observations, demonstrate that people must follow this principle if they're going to live long term, if it's a viable value. That's the standard. When I first started my website in 2014, I called it ifwewilllive.com. And it was the idea is, hey, everything I'm saying here is going to be predicated on the choice that we will flourish. And then what are the requirements that we can objectively connect to that choice to flourish? That's opposite of Kant's approach in every way. Okay, Jacob, I saw you had your hand raised. So Jacob and then Isaac after that.
Yeah, I just want to say I remember that site back when I was the Christian egoist and you were If We Will Live. And then I think there was Reason and View where we both contributed a little bit. And then finally we did FTNCI. That's funny. I forgot about all that. To Rob's question, and to add to what you and Andrew have both said, I think it's important to not get into the habit of thinking that the way that we do worldview is slap God onto an idea, and that is what makes it true, or that's what makes it right or Christian. So there's the aspect that Cody pointed out about general revelation and non-believers and people who have even never read scripture having access to general revelation. But in addition to that, there are general revelation is specific information about specific things. And in this case, there are certain true details about man and especially the nature of man that can be understood through general revelation. And those details are what ground our value as individuals. It's not merely that there's a God, and it's not merely that God created us, because God also created everything else, which doesn't have the value that we have, right? Now, you could say it's that God created us in his image, but what do you mean by that? Does in God's image refer to anything objective and concrete in our nature? And the answer has to be yes. Otherwise, it's just an arbitrary phrase that doesn't mean anything, right? So what is it about the specific nature of man, as opposed to the nature of everything else that God created, that makes it true to say that we are in the image of God? And whatever those details are, those are things that are available, knowable to the atheist through general revelation. And those are the types of things that we think Rand identified. Maybe not all of them. And in fact, because it is a spiritual reality in addition to a physical one, and because it is tied up into the nature of God in many respects, the closer you get down into the nature of man through general revelation, the closer you're getting to things that an objectivist who hates God is going to naturally recoil from. And so as you study those things, and this is one of the things that I studied a lot when I was doing my Master of Arts in Philosophy, as you get into the details, like of the technical philosophy, of the nature of man, of the nature of the mind, right? Which objectivists would absolutely affirm the nature of the mind. But when you get into the technical details of how does the mind differ from the body? How does the mind interact with the body? Is the mind reducible to the body? Those are places where the objectivist is going to start slipping up, because then they have to start choosing between what they're affirming about the truth of the value and the uniqueness of man and the spiritual reality that they're coming to heads with. And so there is a conflict, but you have to get into the details in order to identify the conflict. You can't just sort of from a 1,000-foot high perspective say, oh, well, they don't have God, so they can't possibly understand it. Well, no, there are a lot of Christians who do believe in God and who would affirm that God created us in his image. But what they mean by that is a complete lie. What they mean by that, what they pack into that ideology or into that phrase is everything false about man. They've got all kinds of false, stupid ideas about the nature of man, even though they affirm, yes, God created us in his image. So just affirming that doesn't really do anything. It's all about the content of what we're referring to when we say that. And the objectivist who doesn't agree that God created us in his image can still identify correctly certain aspects of what that means objectively. Does that make sense? And is that helpful?
I agree with that. And Rob, you're welcome to interact with Jacob on that point.
Yeah, and I tried to click my video, but it wasn't coming on.
Here, let me add you on video. It's funny. I just had to like tell each time I have to give permission. There we go.
Yeah, no, that is very helpful, and I think that's what I was trying to articulate, which is it seems like as they better understand the true nature of man, they're getting a revealed image of God as well. But at some point, they just don't make that last connection, which I think you articulated well. That at some point they have to start choosing certain aspects, but because it seems like the roads are converging, and at some point they start pulling back or resisting that convergence of because you said it well, as they understand the true nature of man, and start to see how that is reflective of God, at some point, I don't know, they can't go those last few steps.
All right, so that is, I think that's an answer to the overall question that you had asked, Rob. But is there anything more overall in that question? And just a reminder, the question was, that so we know the importance of the individual because we know that God created us. That's part of how we know the importance of the individual. And then you said, but progressives specifically care about humanity, but they hate people. Is there anything about that angle that you wanted to bring into it?
Well, I think that's the one that's just it's a head scratcher, really. If you're talking to somebody on social media who virtue signals about how much they care about mankind, but then they're just completely nasty to individuals, or less personally when they just believe they act like they care about the collective, but then their policies are destructive to the individual. I mean, I think those are, as you're trying to engage people, if you can do it in a non-necessary, if the environment's right and you can do it in a non-condescending way, there are questions you can ask that hopefully get them to think about those inconsistencies. But many people are unwilling to do that. But it almost makes you laugh to see them, purport to be caring, and then demonstrate, to any individual they interact with how uncaring they are.
The interesting thing about that phenomenon is you can observe it in the outside world. You can also observe it within churches. And so, because Christians can accept collectivism as well. And Christians can elevate abstractions over the concretes as well. And that's something that say you're a pastor and you say, I love doing my job. My job is building up the kingdom of God. But that's sort of an abstraction in your mind. But when it comes to like accepting somebody, somebody has invited you over for lunch. Are we going to today for 2 hours make the decision to commit my time to this person and my focus to this person? They may say, well, I don't really feel like doing that. And that's understandable. I mean, I've worked in ministry jobs before. I've worked as a music leader, and you have the ability to invest as much as you want into hundreds of different people's lives. And sometimes it's easy for somebody that's in that ministry position to say, I just love building the church. I love what's good for the church. I love doing God's work. But then when it comes to God's work this hour, you don't feel like it, or maybe you don't like that person or whatever. So yeah, that can happen to anybody. And it's a matter of translating from the abstraction and the overall plan to the individual actions that will build what you're trying to build. and that's true for your work life. It's, it's one thing to plan your day. It's another thing to work through the messy middle. And that's one of the great difficulties in life. But we definitely see it within the collectivists. The collectivists that talk so much, even in sweeping theological terms, about the glory of the bride of Christ, but then they will slander you and lie about you immediately as soon as they talk to you. It's like there's a disconnect here. That collectivist mindset certainly is not serving them. Anything you want to add about that or interact with, Rob?
No, I think that helps. I mean, it's exactly what I was thinking.
Okay, Isaac, you've been waiting. Let's put you on camera. You just have to accept the co-host permission, Isaac, and then you can jump on.
Sorry, I'm looking for, is that supposed to pop up?
I am not sure. I can ask you to unmute. There we go. I see you.
All right. So this one really small part stood out to me. Prosperity, not economic equality, is a value. And I think that this relates to some of what we're talking about. The value that we have in mind, I think, when it comes to capitalists, the value is freedom. For socialists, the value is something more like economic equality. And when you think about that, economic equality sounds nice. And I think that's true. I think, you can, both sides of the aisle can say, yes, it's true. It sounds nice. And socialists want to stop right there and start making policies based on that, as if that's the height of morality, an idea sounding nice. But the people on the other, those, selfish people on the other side of the aisle will say, well, that's not enough. Just because something sounds nice doesn't mean that's good enough. And so when you think about this idea, as I was thinking about it, something that stood out to me, economic equality isn't enough because it misses the forest for the trees. Think about it, it's the idea of you will own nothing and be happy, right? Like, imagine everybody owning the same thing, nothing. What are the basic needs of life? Food, shelter. I mean, we could just stop right there, food and shelter. Let's say everybody owned 1 carrot. Economic equality achieved, done, good job, right? That doesn't make sense. If everybody owns 1 carrot, you'll eat that carrot one day and then you'll have nothing the next. So economic equality just it isn't enough. It sounds nice in theory, but when you break it down in reality, it's like that's not the goal. Economic equality isn't the goal. Prosperity, that's a much better value. That's the real value. And there's some other quotes around that. This is on page 45, by the way. Some other quotes around that. The system of individual rights means unleashed brain power of potentially billions of human beings and the stupendous creativity and productivity that follows in its train. On the next page, it says something similar. Capitalism superbly performs 2 tasks. It upholds and legally protects individual rights, and because of this, it facilitates creation of vast amounts of intellectual and material wealth. So the reason why we love capitalism is because it doesn't just protect individual rights. It's not just moral, but it also achieves prosperity. So we start with the morality of it, and we end up with prosperity, which is a vastly superior value than economic equality. I have a little bit more to say, but I just, if people want to chime in at this point, they can.
Yeah, that's an outstanding point. And there's a related point on page 28 where they're talking about, can we do good by force? And that's like the World Economic Forum's vision, is that you'll own nothing except for maybe a bicycle and you'll be happy, and that somebody else will manage your property. Somebody else will manage everything that you accomplish in life. And the problem that Rand's vision and that Americanism as an idea would have with that idea is that, like you mentioned, the creation of wealth and the building of your life, it has a spiritual component to it, not just a material component to it. You can tell that the World Economic Forum guys, they're materialists. I mean, they are Hegelian. What do you call it? The dialectic materialism is what they advocate. Dialectic materialism. That's another word for that is Marxism, of course. But in this book on page 29, we say, when a group of people declare that something is good for you, regardless of what you think, and regardless of whether you would choose to try to attain it, they are declaring that they have done the necessary thinking and judging for you. You therefore don't have to. But the trouble is that's bypassing the role of the mind, which is kind of like if there was, imagine if there was a video game, and in the video game you have to go and you have to press the button, and then everything else happens after that. It's like, well, the whole point was the action, the choices, playing it the way I wanted to play it, making these choices. And by taking away the choice, you're also taking away the capacity of the individual human mind to value that which is being chosen. There's a person that could be perfectly happy in the career as a doctor if they chose it. Rand explains in another passage somewhere. But if their parents forced them into that career as a doctor, they may resent it simply by the fact that it was not their own choice, because the amount of work that it takes to follow that career and to succeed in that is so much that you would have to know going into it that it was because you cared about it. It was because you embraced that as a choice. Otherwise, you'd not have the fuel to get there. And I noticed that Rob mentioned something very similar, so I'm just going to read his comment. He said, socialist solutions are mainly, if not solely, materialistic. They ignore the moral, emotional, and spiritual value of work contributing to society. They only focus on the money aspect. Did you want to add anything, Isaac? And then after that, we can go back to Jacob.
Yeah, I wanted to relate this back to something that Rob was talking about a little bit. And he mentioned something along the lines of how socialists only care about the collective and they don't ever care about the individual. And I wanted to try to sort of speak to why that is. And I think it's because of this economic equality principle that socialists have in their mind. They'll do anything, they'll advocate for anything if in their mind it makes everybody more equal. They don't give a damn if it hurts an individual in the process, because again, it's about equality. So if you're up here, but somebody's down here, we'll knock you down a peg, we'll hurt you, we'll destroy you until you come down to everybody else's level. And so in their minds, when they see a big house and they have a small house, they go, that's not fair. That's not fair. Well, what's your standard of justice? What do you mean it's not fair? And I know Jacob said we don't want to slap God on everything, and I agree, but I do want to say that's a violation of the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet. When you look at a big house and you say, that's not fair, that's coveting.
Jacob, do you want to jump in? I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, you might have to invite me to be on video again because my internet crapped out, so I had to leave and come back. I'm glad that I'm glad that Isaac ended talking about covetousness because that was a point that I wanted to make about this. The focus on equality is fundamentally second-handed, it's envy-based, and it's man-fearing. It's all about how do I relate to other men? How do I measure up in the society of men? What is the difference between me and other people? It's obsessed with the horizontal and almost despises the vertical because the vertical is necessarily individual. Our relationship to God is necessarily individual first, right? Whereas the focus on prosperity is first-handed It says, I don't care about my relationship to other people. I'm going to work as hard as I can to achieve as much as I can, regardless of what that compares to other people, right? It's based in confidence rather than in envy. I don't care about other people, so why should I be concerned about someone having more than me? Good for them. Let that be an inspiration to me, rather than being envious of them. What reason do I have to envy them if they earned it? And then it's God-fearing because it's focused on I want to please God by burning as brightly as I can through the nature that He's given me to do the most good in this life, to build the biggest kingdom possible in this life for Him, right? The way that I think about it, the idea that we're going to lay our crowns at His feet. I want a big freaking crown. I want to build as much as I possibly can, as great as I possibly can, so that I've got a lot to lay down at His feet. And then in addition to that, there's rewards in heaven and things like that. But it should be God-centered, blinders on almost, as in I don't care what other people are doing, other than perhaps for inspiration, right? Because if someone's doing something really excellent, that can be great fuel for your soul when you're discouraged. If you have failed 16 times and you look over and you see someone who failed 300 times, but they're making it big now, that can be super encouraging. So the only reason for the prosperity mindset, the only reason to look at other people is for inspiration, not for comparison to be envious. So that there's just a fundamental difference in the psychological mindset of those two views of focusing on equality versus focusing on prosperity.
Jacob, I would say that one of the great learning experiences I've had is seeing my kids. I have a 7-year-old boy, and when he is playing with his Legos, building something, that is all he's thinking about. He's doing it because he loves doing it. And then when he shows it to me, he has that joy in showing it to his dad. And what greater joy in life do we have from day to day? But that you could say to your own dad, like, look what I did, and your dad loves it. That kind of joy is, I believe, what we're going to have in heaven when we're laying down those crowns. And I mean, think about the purity of the motivations in a child like that, in a 7-year-old. That is the kind of purity that we should have, whether we're doing our computer programming jobs or whether we're writing for our jobs or building a house for our jobs. We do it because God made us to do it, and we feel God's pleasure when we do it, and we live for that feeling of God's pleasure in our lives. I mean, that's the kind of motivation that I want to have, and the kind of joy that I want to work for. I saw a comment from Ryan. He said about this utopia topic and about the socialist vision of egalitarianism. He says, if you believe that utopia is achievable in this life and that the only thing standing in the way is a few individualists, why wouldn't you use force to get them out of the way? They would think, if utopia is just around the corner where everyone's going to be happy, why wouldn't it be worth it to just sacrifice a few of these obstructionists? And that's the socialist saying, is it's going to take, you're going to have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. We're the eggs that they want to crack, that's for sure. And they're working toward their vision of heaven, and they think that it is achievable on earth. That is a major problem. It's interesting because they're willing to sacrifice people's lives. They always have been. You can ask them; they would say they will be. But historically, the mass graves and the mass murders have shown that they're willing to sacrifice people's lives. But it's interesting because when you compare that vision of society to the vision of society that says it's not the government's job to make sure that everybody has access to a doctor. It's the government's job to make sure that everybody has freedom. People will look at that and they say, "Oh, that's heartless," and it shows you that they're not looking at the big picture, or they're not willing to think in principle about that issue. Because under capitalism, there will be people that experience difficulty, but they'll use that as an argument for why we should take away everybody's freedom. And I don't know. I think that when they close their eyes to the situation in Venezuela, or when they close their eyes to the 20th century and the amount of murders that took place, it demonstrates to you that they it's not a problem with it's not a problem with lack of knowledge. It's that they're choosing not to care about those things. We have time for probably one or two more comments, and then we're going to wrap up. I see you're on, Andrew. Did you have anything you want to share?
Nope.
All
Just
right.
along for the ride.
Wonderful. I would say maybe in the upcoming week, I'll bring up some other topics. And between now and then, if anybody wants to message me and say, hey, let's make sure to talk about this. I think a useful one would be to talk about, do Jacob and Cody and the Christian Intellectual Project, do they agree with the libertarians on the idea that taxation is theft? And if so, to what extent do we agree with them? To what extent do we disagree? Because I mean, that's most people that are going to be interested in this video series are going to be constitutional conservatives, perhaps libertarian-ish, perhaps libertarian. I think that's the kind of topic that would be fruitful if people have questions. And then some other topics that we could talk about are objections to what we're doing here. You've seen in the last 3 hours of discussion that we've done that we're trying to bring in observations from Ayn Rand. One objection is, well, aren't you being syncretistic? Just like, why do you need Ayn Rand in the first place? And my answer is, we don't. Ayn Rand wrote some ideas and argued effectively, and she makes a good guide through some of these confusing topics. We don't need Ayn Rand, but I do think that we do need philosophy. We do need general revelation, and we do need Christians working on these questions. And it's the ability to ask good questions that we see in Ayn Rand that nobody can just dismiss out of hand and say, well, you know, we don't need good questions. We don't need philosophy. But Jacob and I will argue very strongly that we do need those things. I wanted to bring on Isaac because you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I just want the comment that you said stood out to me when you said they say that you're heartless for. Can you remind me of the context of that a little bit more? Just
letting people, let's say somebody is poor, but
right.
Shouldn't we have a social program for them?
Right. So I would reply and say, I don't know exactly what you mean by heartless, but I would say you're faithless. When God says thou shalt not steal, and also says that the poor will always be with you, and you think that you can fix that by breaking God's commandments, you're faithless.
Yes.
And also, I don't think I'm heartless. I think I'm actually the loving one, because Jesus said that love is what sums up all the commandments. You don't love by breaking one of the commandments.
That's a mic drop. All right, let me wrap up. Jacob, did you have anything you wanted to add before I wrap up?
Nope.
All right. Well, okay, I want to thank everybody for watching today. And if you participated live, especially, because it's way more fun with you guys and way more valuable, I think. So if you're watching on YouTube, please click like on the video, make sure you're subscribed. And I want to invite everybody that sees this. We're going 9 weeks, so we have 6 more after this. And you can go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism. You can find all of our replays there, and you can find the place to sign up. So it's not too late to join. And I want you to know you're not required to show up every week. We're keeping things informal. This is free. This is just getting to know each other. That's the goal. So we're building foundation for future things, and this is a good time that you could get involved. So make sure that if you are subscribed to our email updates so that you don't miss things from us. It's at christianintellectual.com/subscribe. Thank you guys for joining today, and I hope to see you at 9 a.m. Eastern next Saturday. God bless.